So this week I decided to develop a short YouTube video to talk about your different logic models that you submitted for theory assignment number 7, because I thought they were all very interesting, they were all very different, and I want to highlight some of the interesting features of each and every one of your logic models. So before I start, what I'd like to say is that what I think is very helpful about a logic model is that it fosters logical thinking as you think about how a program works. So many of you either want to develop a program or you want to assess a program, and that this is a very useful tool for thinking things through. And usually you create it and you think about it and you make modifications, so it's not just a once and done kind of thing. I'd like to start with Sabina's logic model, and you can see up here that she's listed the program as this nurse practitioner transition to practice program, and it is for this situation of this transitional period for nurse practitioners. So let's just take a look at some of what she has in her input section, and here you see the necessity for getting a program off the ground of approval from important stakeholders, support from important stakeholders, collaborating with these important entities, and obviously getting approval to do the program, and then people who will actually participate in your program. So obviously there'd be some monetary inputs as well, but these are all very important inputs to think about that you would need to be able to move forward. And then here we're looking at some of these implementation activities that would occur. This feedback loop to support communication, pairing new nurse practitioners with a mentor. So this lays out those activities that you think are important, and then these important, and then I think, actually, interestingly enough, I think outputs are probably one of the trickiest things to develop, and one of the hardest things to figure out what needs to go into that output column. So here we might imagine one output would be, how many pairs have you formed, or is this feedback loop actually happening? Can you document that this feedback loop is working? And then we get to these important outcomes. So here we want to assess whether mentors feel like they're receiving the support that they need. So if they have the support, is it actually happening? And do they perceive that it's supportive? And if we move then on to these medium goals, we would want to see these positive relationships being developed, and nurse practitioners are experiencing success and their confidence is improving, which will then hopefully lead to this successful transition into their new role, and that they will be and this will increase retention. So you can see in this process the requirement for linking together how the input would lead to the activities, and the activities would lead to the outputs, and the outputs would lead to the short, medium, and long-term outcomes. In essence, it's a cause and effect, and a cause and effect. So each input leads to this effect. I would characterize Mary Sue's logic model as a logic model for a formative evaluation, the work that is needed to develop a program, that formative work. And in this case, we see the logic model about this capital budget process with this idea of developing a consistent process. for making this budget request. And so in this case, we see some different inputs. It's not the inputs for the program, but it's the inputs needed to develop this process. What are these critical elements? We have to identify those. What are best practices for developing or for current budget processes? So it's the groundwork that needs to be done to think about how you will develop this process, with the idea of an activity of developing this standard email for soliciting a request and a matrix that will weigh these requests for different types of capital equipment. So what's interesting here is to look at these outcomes, I think. And here what we see, these outcomes are this idea of being able to provide this tool that's developed to managers, being able to institute this standardized approach. So here's where we really see that the program kind of coming together. After doing this work, you lead to this program, but you can tell this is still in its formative stage, because it's rolling it out and wanting to collect this feedback to be able to understand, is it working the way you want it to? So how many people are using it, and what is their perception of whether it's valuable and easy to use? And it's important to gather this feedback in what we would think of as a formative evaluation, because it gives you an opportunity to correct things or to improve things so that this process is working better. And then as you get to this next stage, you have more people using. It's becoming, if we think about the diffusion of innovations, it's not just the early adopters. And in this case, this is not only early adopters, but this kind of still formative testing. And now we're getting to a broader use and likely of a process that's been honed and developed based on the feedback from the first kind of rollout. And so again, you're still assessing how many are using it, and this perception as a way to be able to track how effectively this process is working, with these then ultimate goals of what they want that process to be able to accomplish. So here we see Siobhan's logic model for her interest to develop, her thinking about of how to develop nurse leaders and foster that development and support that development to generate our next to develop our next generation of nurse leaders. And once again, this is a formative endeavor. So what do you need to develop this type of programming? So here you see some of the things that she's identified as important to developing this program. Obviously, support from these entities, money, dollars, being able to identify competency, and these RNs who are considering leadership. So next we get to the idea of these various activities, and you see a kind of a breadth of activities being proposed here. It's the idea of investing, of starting to think about this and being willing to prioritize this issue and to invest in it. Funding, coaching and competency training, developing these learning and development opportunities. How do we identify the characteristics of these RNs who are interested in management, that have a drive to become a manager, and that will be high performers? So a set of things, of activities that need to happen to be able to produce these outputs of these things become part of strategic planning, and that RN managers are completing this training and attending these these learning and development opportunities, and you're identifying qualified candidates, people who have a competency in leadership, and you're nurturing that. But you're also you're finding the right people to be able to nurture as you move forward. And then you can see how this starts leading to these outcomes of changing the environment, nurse managers who are feeling supported. So you once again see a kind of a breadth of short-term outcomes that then result in the development of nurse managers to be more satisfied and to feel more certainty in what they're doing. With these long-term outcomes of improved clinical outcomes, filling these manager positions, decreasing turnover, and improved culture. So once again, this idea of how do we form something like this and get it off the ground and get the support that is required to do a program.